I'm the K part of the JK Gibson-Graham. This is the J part.
So we didn't, I don't know if we had a format. We just were going to open it up, and then a few minutes before you guys got here, I asked some members of my class if they would get together and come up with some questions. We spent last week on the first half of your book, and this week is reading the second half. So does anyone feel that they want to bravely launch into the topic? Yes?
You know, I would like, in reading this book, it was... It was beautifully written, and I was wondering, before we talk about the context, about the working relationship you have had and how you maintain that kind of relationships, and how you end up, to me, seeming like one voice, which I think is what makes this book like a beautiful read.
Thank you. You want to start out?
Well, it's expensive.
If you live in two different countries.
Yeah, but so far away from each other. Yeah, we've spent a lot of time together, actually. You know, over the years. So it's like 33 years now. Started writing papers together in graduate school.
Second semester, I think we had a course with Dick Pete, and we negotiated with him to write a joint paper.
Yeah, we handed in our other course we were taking too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's and then a lot of phone calls. It started out in the days it was $50 every phone call because it was $1 per minute, and so we only spoke every once a month.
Yeah. So early on, we were as graduate students, we were in a collective of students who were all working on, I guess, questions around regional development and the internationalisation of capital. It was the beginning of the kind of interest in globalisation, and I mean, Cindy Katz was part of that group, and Paul Sussman, a whole lot of people. So we were interested in a collective practice, I suppose. But the two of us took that a bit further by working together, but we were actually part of a group of 4 people who wrote together as well immediately after graduate school. 2 others, one an economist and the other a geographer. And then as the years went by, it kind of whittled down to Julie and I working just together. And it wasn't until 93 that we put our names together, because we were kind of... 92. She's a good one on the dates and the details. Roughly, then. Yeah, because I suppose it was the height of postmodernism in academia, and we were interested in playing around with authorship. And it was always a debate: was it going to be Gibson and Graham, or Graham or Gibson? And at that point, we'd already started to, run our careers somewhat together in terms of figuring out who needed what for what tenure battle or what this kind of thing. And at that stage, we were both tenured, so we didn't need to worry about it anymore. So we put our names together. But in terms of the actual writing practice, we do different things. Yeah. So sometimes one of us will draft something, and then the other will re-edit it or redraft it. But often we plan things together in terms of talking through the ideas, and then divide up who's going to write what.
And then the other person works to unstick the person who's writing, because every day, if you write all day, you're stuck by the end. And so we get up in the morning and unstick the person.
And since you're on different continents, you actually can do a 24-hour.
We really just do it when we're together.
More or less right when we're together. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But I think, one thing came out just writing this last piece, which is, you'll get to judge what you think of it tomorrow, those of you that come to the lecture. But someone was asking us about how do we do our work. And we realised that we both, when you get to that moment when you're writing, you just think it's all rubbish, and everyone else has said this before, or there's nothing of value here. Well, and that usually takes, if you're writing by yourself, maybe a week to get over, or sometimes 6 years. You know? So for us, we kind of that turns around very fast, because the other person can say, no, there's something here. We've still got something, or that's fantastic. So there's a sort of self-admiration, mutual. So the other thing about it is, we never are that critical. I mean, in the sense, we can figure out when we're not being clear, but we never are critical in a way that often you've had your writing read by somebody else, and they immediately now come back with criticism of it that actually makes you feel worse, even though it's supposed to be constructive. So I think that's partly the value, and that's what's helped our writing, because then you can be more adventurous. I mean, if someone's saying, that was a lovely way to say it, but do it more like that, whereas you're thinking you're out on a limb with something, and you're thinking you're getting a bit too fanciful or something, well, the other person will push you along to be more creative. So I think that's, to me, the element is an environment where it supports creativity, whereas I think a lot of people's experience of collaboration is the opposite of that.
It feels safer, you know. You don't feel like you're just out there on your own.
Yeah, so even if everyone else hates it, which they did for many years, we still thought we had something to say.
Somebody asked me once, well, what happens when you disagree? And I actually, realized we don't disagree. That's not how it works. We talk about stuff, but it would be like disagreeing with yourself. You actually have an ongoing conversation with yourself about stuff, where your views change, but you don't disagree.
No, but I mean, often one of us will voice those voices, the critical voices, or what the mainstream might be saying about this, or because they're voices you also have. So, but it's not put out as a criticism.
Right. Yeah. So it feels like a really safe space. I mean, the other thing is, it's like, I don't know how many of you have kids, but when you have kids, it's very hard to go to your friends and say, what fantastic things my kids did. Because it's like, what if their kids aren't doing that well? It's very hard to brag about your kids. It's the same thing with your career, and your work. It's very hard to tell people how excited you are about this fantastic thing that happened, or what this fantastic thing somebody said about how they liked it, or something. You just can't go to your colleague and say, do you want to hear what so-and-so said about my paper? And so it's like having the other parent, where you can share those moments that make you feel great.
That's more about the collaboration than, I guess, the writing. You're more interested in the writing.
No, but I think it comes out of the book, like that very intense relationship you have. And that's why I was interested in hearing about it, because it's also, I think, an inspiration for the rest of us.
Yes, but what I'm interested in finding out from you guys is why. I mean, we've been doing this, we started working together 33 years ago, and we've been having the collaborative name since '92. But so few other people do it. So not necessarily the naming thing, but the working collaboratively. So I'm just wondering what it is about the way we, the whole education system is set up, or whatever it is, that prevents people from building these kind of relationships early on, like now at your stage. I mean, how much the whole push to be an individual and to have your own mark on things kind of overshadows the opportunities that there are to actually work like this.
Because it is more fun.
It's much more fun.
I'm
Maybe
not
some of you
doing this by myself.
And then, there all sorts of life things happen to us. One gets knocked down with cancer, then the other one, and then one finds it hard to breathe. Hey, look, we're a collective, it doesn't really matter.
Together we can breathe.
But it's an interesting question, I think, that's worth putting out there.
Well, I just remember my friend Helen saying when she was in English at Harvard, that you didn't speak to the other people in your class. She was getting a PhD. So all her friends were in anthropology or physics or something like that. I found geography not to be very bad.
That's really a clever class.
Yeah, it is. And yet we don't have a lot of long-term collaboration. Maybe there's just not, it's not, not all your professors aren't doing it, so then it's sort of like the science model. Everybody is doing it that way in science, so everybody keeps doing it that way.
And we started to write with other of our ex-graduate students and faculty members. So you'll see more articles with J.K. Gibson-Graham and somebody and us.
Or just one of us.
Or just one of our students. So who's got a question about the book?
Or anything. You can ask us about anything.
Or tell us what you're doing.
Well,
We're being videotaped.
Well, let's forget about that.
That's when I said that to one of my classes once. The first question I got was, where did you get that belt?
This is an ethical question, which I guess is good for
Oh, good.
And it's, I don't know if you have an answer to it, but I'd be interested to hear what you hear about. It's a question that you raised in the book that's left deliberately unanswered, and I think it has to do with sort of the boundaries between the legal and the illegal economy, for example. Where I work, which is a big, booming city in Mexico, a lot of people get their water supply through illegal means, illegal taps. They have all kinds of distribution systems. And when you think about the cumulative side of it, it is obviously, unauthorized, illegitimate on many levels. But when you look at the distributive moment, which is what I think your work brings out so much for economic geography, it's actually sort of recreating a commons or a community economy, even though it's a sort of unauthorized, illegitimate economy. This is probably true for all kinds of black markets and activity around the world, not just with water, but any sort of commodity out there. And so I guess my question is, can theft be part of the community economy? Where do you draw the lines between, it's a moral question, where do you draw the lines between something like illegal sex trafficking of women versus, people creating community water supply out of stolen water? And how do you yourselves sort of negotiate those dynamics? Or anyone else in the room?
Well, we included theft in the diagram of the diverse economies, but the idea about, that framework is not supposed to be a what we want or don't want kind of framework. It's just it's as we say, a kind of mere description of things out there. So I think, the question of how you view theft morally or legally is going to be very contextual, and that's the case with a lot of these kind of things. It's too hard to. There's no answer at an abstract level to that question.
Right, because land reform could be seen in a lot of cases as theft, and yet, not.
Yeah, so there's many ways in which I think you'd have to situate it, and the question of even those cases of, say, sex trafficking or the case of the word I've worked on, domestic service. People see it as a form of slavery, and there's a whole discourse around it as being extremely exploitative, and there you could have a whole analysis of that as something that should be banned, which I think many of the left groups in the Philippines do have that kind of analysis. But then there's others who see it as, that it can work in certain contexts and also be an opportunity for other kinds of economic development to spin off from. So, but it's going to be very contextual how that works. And the water issue, again, I think I know there's cases where, say in South Africa, I think, where people were forced to do that because of the privatisation of water, which before that those kind of distributed systems had been legal and they became unlegal. And so I think that's been the basis of a major social movement. So I think in every instance one would have to start to look into the different issues before you can decide, I think. The whole movement against the enclosures with the diggers back in 17, whatever it was, was arguing against the legality of enclosure of people's land. So the whole basis of private property, and so obviously in this country as well, the basis of private property was theft in the first place. So who's to say what's moral? You know, once you add any history into these questions, it becomes murky. But I think, and we never kind of argued for hard and fast. That's sort of strong theory.
I suppose people would call that situational.
Situated which is unsatisfactory for those that want kind of blueprints and cut and dry kind of stuff.
In fact, we used to get a lot of comments about the diagram because people wanted it to be clean. They wanted it just to be good stuff. You know?
Which is more where we see the community economies kind of debate around what are the ethical practices and relationships that you might want to build.
The diverse economy, it's page 71.
So I think that's something that is often misunderstood in our work, is the distinction we make between doing a kind of an inventory of the diverse economy, just looking at what's out there that is supporting
sort of
people.
Economic ontology.
And then the project of trying to build community economies where ethical sort of relationships that a particular kind of community might value are enacted. In which case, the community economy you just described around water would be something that you'd want to support and want to fight to make it legal.
Yeah, there's quite a lot you can learn from something that emerges from a sort of illegal space. That can also be used against people. With all sorts of messed up power relations and whatnot. But at the same time, I agree with you that it's situational. It's just hard to sort of navigate ethical coordinates around that, especially when you're trying to make arguments to policy or through politics.
We just watched the 3rd season of The Wire.
I teach that.
So there you go. That was a great example.
Right. My students today were talking about how, when you look at how the drug trade on the streets of Baltimore, which is huge. I mean, actually, what journalists have investigated this, and it's probably the only form of capital that's flowing through West Baltimore and East Baltimore. And it is actually maintaining social reproduction and allowing some people to survive, even though it's sort of cast in this historical messed up production of that city in particular. But
then that guy,
the black and the white, drawing the lines, it's hard.
But then sort of semi-legalizing it in a certain area of the city to clean it up was a very interesting strategy.
It's all positive. What happened to it, Just because it actually worked.
On the diagram, I asked this because I had a student who was working directly from your project in some work of hers in West Philadelphia. And she was investigating a Lowe's which found its way into a neighborhood not unlike the parts of West Philadelphia that are shown in The Wire. A Lowe's.
West Baltimore in The Wire.
It's like a home.
West Philadelphia? Well, actually, she was investigating.
What is that word?
Lowe's, it's the name of a box store.
Oh,
yeah, sorry. It's
okay.
like a Home Depot.
Yeah.
Oh, Lowe's.
And that's right, you would think that capital would be completely global.
Yes, well, we do have a Lowe's, actually. I'm sure it's not that one.
And in this store, they provided spaces for community engagement and bulletin boards and childcare kind of activities. And so her take on the Lowe's, of which essentially she was normatively agnostic with respect to this store, because a lot of the people in the community really wanted to have the store and then a few ancillary things that developed next to it that helped reduce the sort of food desert that this development went into. And there was a lot of civic leadership inside the community that was in favor of getting the big box store and tearing down houses and really transforming at least this part of the neighborhood. One of the things that she was trying to work through in this project of hers was the extent to which this formal capitalist enterprise, consumptively organized, was leveraging all the kind of things that are at the underneath the water line in your diagram. And I wondered if you had some other studies that through graduate students or something like that. It was kind of, it's almost like old economic base analysis. Well, if you get this, how much of this underneath stuff do you actually end up producing?
The multiplier effect.
It's a multiplier effect.
Top,
right.
Yeah.
The tip of the iceberg is productive of all kinds of really distributed things. And it was partly because when the corporation came in, at least they espoused the line of social responsibility. And so what that did was it kind of, in collaboration with the community, produced a real proliferation of just scores of activities that are on the underside of the iceberg.
So it's not really expert-based in the sense that
it's not.
It's in retailing.
Yeah. Right. It's
to local people.
Leverage is probably a better way to think about it.
Yeah,
it's a dialectic maybe between us.
It's sort of interesting because it really calls expert-based into question.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So was the suggestion that the company was doing it purely to get its market lock-in, or was there an openness there?
I think the company understood the significance of what they were doing because they really located in an inner city location, which is completely against anything they had ever done before.
Okay.
And
what are they trying? The base of the pyramids kind of thing where, okay, now they're going to market to, since they now market to everybody.
To everyone else.
Everybody else. Now they're going to try to market to the poorest people.
It could have been saturation and the fact that they could undercut whatever local, sort of indigenous hardware
this
capital.
is the new market,
Right.
with 2 billion people in the world who live on less than $1 a day. How do we turn them into a market? That's the idea.
Right. I mean, it's part of that, but then they were aware of the issues associated with debates around gentrification and what this might do to the neighborhood in terms of changing its color composition and that kind of thing. So,
do you think it was a gentrifying type of thing, a Lowe's?
It was an experiment, I think, for the company.
I mean, really, who's going to want to gentrify the area around the Lowe's?
Right. Yeah.
It's not really gentrification.
Right. So they allow the community, for example, to hold yard sales in their parking lot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sure, so that becomes Economies. Okay.
Right, exactly right. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of activities that are generated through that.
So it was under the umbrella of social responsibility.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of that must be happening with the rise of that kind of discourse in the private sector.
Yeah.
And the question is
if it's with marketing to a new segment.
Yes. Yeah.
Very interesting and weird.
I guess it's in a way
everybody's against the big banks. Our circles, academic circles.
Well, and everyone used to be against capitalism or capitalist corporations, but capitalist corporations can do all sorts of things, become green or. So, but when the people that were being catered to didn't have any role in changing the actual ownership relationships or what happened to the profits that were being accrued in that.
There is some kind of profit sharing with the community.
Really?
Yeah. Microcredit through
really?
the store for
wonderful.
Various kinds of.
Yeah, of course you want to do that though, so that they can buy stuff and refurbish houses basically.
Is it microcredit or is it just?
No, they were doing microcredit with churches and other civic organizations.
Because that's different than just lending people money to buy your shit.
But I think the answer is a question. I don't think we've had any other people studying that kind of situation. But in a way, it's one that's open to the kind of the identity of the capitalist corporation. Then as someone under question, I guess. So some people would want to call it hybridity or a hybrid corporation, or someone would want to just try and disaggregate the different transactions that were happening in that space and try and map them onto diverse economies or whatever, and how you
There's
end up
definitely
seeing
a
it.
corporation in that space, but there's a lot of other stuff going on there too.
There's I guess, parallels to some extent in sort of fair trade food arrangements and coffee and that kind of thing. So where the corporation goes green and then, but this was just, and then there of course is literature that's developed around that and the problems associated with it, whatever positivity you might attach to that. But the leverage part of it was, I thought, very interesting and kind of new. And I imagine that a corporation getting a hold of either some of the tables or just the diagram course, which is really evocative, and say, hey, if we do this, we can produce all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And
why would they want to? What's to sustain the community that's sustaining that store?
exactly right. Yeah.
It'd be nice if more of the coal corporations started leveraging solar power.
Right.
They're supposed to be doing, but not.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. And it's also interesting that it was that kind of a business that was the catalyst for all these other kinds of economic activities. Instead of driving them out as the vision.
So that would be an interesting thing for other communities to try.
About people in their suburbs.
When a Lowe's decides to come in, they could say, hey, but in this other community, Lowe's let us do X, Y, and Z. You're going to do that too?
Right.
So I wonder if the community has any influence on purchasing, because of course what distinguishes big box stores is their kind of tyrannical kind of purchasing agreements they have with their suppliers who Walmart's famous for requiring their suppliers to bring it in cheaper each month. That pushes all of them to engage in. You know what I mean? And so that would be sort of interesting to see whether the community could have any influence on anything about the law.
Right. There's no social responsibility around the supply chain.
Yeah, that would be I suppose that would be where it might move.
That would be radical.
I mean, if all those activities ended up becoming expressed through consumer power and pressure on the company to do that kind of stuff, that would be an organising task, though.
And also buying local or something like that, which they don't do. Because that's not how you get it cheapest. Almost efficiently. It's not. You don't get economies of scale if you buy local.
Right.
That's how they function. So I do remember that the Trader Joe's that came into our area, I went in the first day and asked them if they bought local. No, said the manager. And I never went back. Okay. So then all my friends were shopping at Trader Joe's. So then I found out 3 years later or so they do buy local. Because our community put the pressure on me. Right. That wasn't because of me. But a lot of people like me.
I actually have a question about transformation. In your book, you discuss the possibility of transforming different subjectivities, and I found that to be really inspirational. But in your view, do you see that particular bodies are able to transform their subjectivities easier, i.e., white or non-white bodies? And so, for instance, I was thinking about Arun Saldana's book on the Goa trans in India, and how race is sort of sticky. And that hippies in particular, white hippies, are sort of able to transform into new beings because they're white. And I was wondering if you see that all bodies, regardless of race, have the same possibility of sort of transforming their subjectivities. And if you don't, how do you take that into consideration? How do you take that differing sort of level of possibility into consideration in your politics of place?
we've been asked that question around gender. That
Right.
In all our action research, seems to be women are the ones that change more or
Around
whatever, or
social
ask
class.
people around.
Then there's a vision that rich people have more room to move. It's that, vision that both hobos and millionaires can sleep under bridges.
Right.
And the vision that there's more choice at the top, wherever it is, in the privileged segment and I'd say we've never really looked into that.
Well, I guess
In the sense of
ontologically, or in terms of given if you're an anti-essentialist, then I think you start from a position that there's no necessary difference between different.
Right, you have to actively do an analysis and show how that worked. You know what I mean?
It's a bit the same answer to this one. It's that situational, isn't it? The particular context in which you're working, and then the analysis that you make of it as to who has. But who has
with all the presumptions about power, though, that go along with the sort of visions, hierarchical visions that we create among different types of people. And then we slap on power distinctions to those other distinctions. So that's an essentialist move to just assume, because it's like assuming capitalists have more power than workers. Just a very common assumption. And let's just bring into what our work has been trying to do is to bring those kinds of presumptions into question. And one of the ways that we've tried to do that is to point out that it's a presumption, and have you ever asked the question, does power necessarily go along with other kinds of differences? Power differences, do they fit like a glove with other kinds of differences? And sort of challenge people to try to really look at these things. And that's been our kind of stance with respect to that.
Can I ask did I interrupt you?
No.
Okay.
No, I was saying, because I didn't have it.
Because you haven't. Okay, that's what I kind of it's sort of a follow-up question on Jessica's question. And specifically in the book, I had a question about your audience, and my question is an extension of the conversation we had last week in JP's course. So if anyone can jump in. So in the beginning of the book, you summon the reader to think differently about production and relations of production, and develop an alternative cognition and also a sentiment about how the world should work, how we should relate to one another in production. And I was wondering, is that perhaps a suggestion or a prescription just for the people in this room who can read the book? Or do you imagine that this would work anywhere? Because I can think of a few places where I've been where if you suggested to someone to be reflexive about themselves and the way they relate to others in their production, it might not be already in their cultural vernacular maybe to kind of develop that kind of attitude. And so
for example, in what context?
Perhaps so perhaps without trying to get away from an essentialist notion of identity, perhaps a community in which maybe related to Arizona, the relations of production were already anti-capitalist or alternative or something that we might be aspiring to here at a Lowe's or something. But
I kind of got from your book that you're calling on people to think of a third space, to not think of productive relations as either capitalist or non-capitalist or socialist, or to think about other possibilities. And so to me that was a suggestion for all of us to kind of look at ourselves and our own work and the way we relate to one another, and think of possibilities and be very creative about it. But perhaps that's not a value that's maybe shared by everyone in the world, to be reflexive of the way
it was, we probably would have written it down.
Relate to the world. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
Well, can I answer completely differently? I'm just going back to finish Jessica's question, because it's really, you prompted me. Which is, I think, we tend to think more about the performativity of our analysis than whether we're getting it right, because we don't actually believe in that there's getting it right, since everybody disagrees on all these things. So that we can't see the usefulness of foreclosing the possibility that people of certain colors can transform themselves as well as other people can. You see what I mean? There doesn't seem to be anything that we would not want to reinforce that idea. If that idea indeed were out there. So we would be pushing ourselves to look for instances that would give examples of quite a range of freedom. Of people that a lot of people assume have no freedom. Does that make sense?
And it's kind of interesting that how much we get hung up on the constraints or on the barriers rather than on the openings.
Well, it's often a moralistic kind of thing. People think, oh yeah, what you're saying is all very well for white people or people of privilege. But, there's people with real problems out there. That was the review we got on one of our papers. People are starving out there. So all this rethinking is not.
But, the other thing is it's not just thinking. I mean, the whole interest in action research is that there has to be engagement. And so the reason we use the slum dwellers of Mumbai story at the beginning, or the way we use the example of savings groups of migrant workers and so on, is that there's a whole practice, collective practice that takes a lot of time for people to even start to think that there might be some other things, other way to live or other way to be, or a way to intersect in the economy and so on. It's not something that we're not expecting those people to read this book.
Sure.
But we are expecting, I suppose, other researchers to read this book and to start to think about the performativity of their research in one sense, but also the actual kind of engagement they're looking for in the research and what it's doing. So, yeah.
Part of our, we've often said that our proximate audience is academia.
Sure.
But our ultimate audience is economic activists who basically felt that they had a very narrow range of movement. Given capitalism and the fact that it was going to be here longer than we could foresee. In other words, like the letter I got from Anna Pietz said, you don't think there'll be anything but capitalism in our lifetimes, do you? So that we were sort of trying to speak to the people who are teaching.
In the research, though, I think there's also the aspect of, there is real resistance that people have to change, and our interest in a kind of more psychoanalytic take on that, I think, means that, there's, in the work I did in the Latrobe Valley, for instance, there was definitely some men who were going to be able to work on this, and others that just weren't. They were so invested in their lost identity, and they were not going to engage in any kind of therapeutic kind of change at that position. So I guess our views have always been as also work with who you can. And even though the expectation was that women were immediately open to the idea that the economies was more than just mining because they were already involved in household economies and stuff like that. They weren't the ones that actually jumped to being involved in the kind of enterprise development kind of work. It was actually a lot of people who were men who were classically the kind of kinds that wouldn't have been joiners, but for various reasons, some of them were open to this. But and our task hasn't been then to work with those that weren't. Well, we haven't seen that as our skill base, but because it would involve a lot more than what we were able to offer in the context of an action research project. So we've also had that sort of opportunistic aspect too. Whilst expecting everyone can change, we know that only some people will be open to it in the moment that you're having that engagement. So why not just work with those rather than keep criticising yourself for not being able to work with everybody. So there's been a kind of instrumental kind of attitude to how we actually progress in the day-to-day research as well. Because once people start to see that there's something happening, a lot of the naysayers come on board later on, so there's that kind of dynamic at hand. But there definitely can be a lot of resistance, and it's real.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to say something.
No, I was just going to say that's actually a really satisfactory response. I mean, I figured when reading the book and thinking the question that I just posed, asking someone to be reflexive about their own work. Yeah, if I can read this book, I think I can probably do that. So, and I think that's great that you have a broad audience in mind, and we can never reach anybody. We can never speak to everybody. So I think that's great, and I think that for that audience that you have, it's wonderfully written. It was a complete page turner. I mean, it's just so nice to read, and really easy to understand, but not overly simple. It was just great for the audience. It was.
How many academic papers are page turners?
I love that. Thank you.
If you want to inspire someone to teach about this, I mean, you've got a good style. It's really good.
And I suppose the other thing is that that's one of our outputs. We've got a lot of different kinds of outputs as well that are much more accessible. Various kind of website, estimated DVD, some go in the Philippines, which, in a way it embodies all that. It's just written and it's presented in a very different way of stories of people starting social enterprises. So we've been always pretty interested in different kinds of outputs that reach different audiences. Julie does a lot of work doing public presentations in her region with community groups and PowerPoint presentations and so on.
That one of the things that changed is us, because doing this work has really given me an entree in a way with all the activists in my region, and I'm really one of them now. Where I wasn't, where I was clearly separated before. I mean, not really separated. I've been in the community for a long time before I was an academic. But now my students, my former students, are involved. So I can see it working. They come through my classes, and then they start a collective, or they do, and so it's like, okay. One thing that's happening at UMass right now is that one of my former students was one of the leaders in setting up the Valley Alliance of Worker Cooperatives, which is exactly what it says it is. Okay, the name. It's a local federation of worker cooperatives. And Nancy Fulbright, who's the well-known famous economist at UMass, started writing about the Mondragon and U.S. Steelworkers Agreement in her New York Times blog. She doesn't have a column like Kirkman, but she does have a blog like he does. And so my students saw this, and he said, can't we make something out of this? And he went to Nancy, and right now I'm aware I'm feeling terrible missing out on this, but there's a group of people from the management department and economics and geography who are starting a series of courses on worker co-ops for UMass undergrads, grad students, and they're hoping to develop an institute, and I'm hoping to make it more of a solidarity economy, to broaden out beyond just that one account form. But just to see this happening, and it's coming through that interaction between academia and the local community. And it's perpetuating that interaction, because what they want to produce is more people who know how to start worker co-ops, who understand it as a business form, etc.
Question. I didn't realise we haven't looked down this end of the table.
No, I got nothing. I was just...
Oh, you're just looking interested. I thought you had a question there.
Hey there.
Yes, Anne's got one.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about the second part of the book when you start talking about the community economy and showing different examples of how it's taking place. And I was thinking whether size plays into this, because you start out with the case of Mondragon, and it seems like the whole idea behind it is very beautiful, but at one point it becomes so big. And when they start outsourcing to Thailand, their ideology kind of gets a break. So I'm just wondering if the idea of community economy, that it has to kind of stay at a certain size in order to function.
Well, again, that's one of those questions where I don't think we've got a hard and fast answer. I mean, the experience of Mondragon, they've had a number of different experiences around scale and size, and one earlier on was once any individual factory got bigger than 200 people, they started to have problems with people feeling like they weren't as involved as others, and that was gave rise to a lot of industrial action and various things by the people who wanted to see themselves more in a union frame, in which case they were opposed to the management rather than being in a cooperative sort of framing. And then after that, I think they shifted towards having a view that any one particular site or factory shouldn't be more than around 200, or was it up to 500? But so I mean, I think there's a whole issue there that we haven't researched, but people could start to think about is the maximum size for various kinds of sociality in the workplace to function and not. The question about the internationalisation and the form of the internationalisation is a really interesting one and a complex one. I don't know that that wasn't to do with size so much as to do with the changing nature of markets and international kind of global economic relationships. The decision to locate in Thailand was initially to start to source cheaper components that, because they couldn't produce them in the Basque region, they were getting locked out of other markets that they had for their cooperatively produced goods. But once, and so the option was to try and invite people into cooperative relationships in these kind of new plants in other places, but they felt that was an imposition again on people, that wasn't an understood relationship. So there's this idea that corporations that they've taken over, or that they locate in some places, some of them are going to be, the people who are involved are eventuales, are going to become eventually cooperators, and the business will become a cooperative business. In other cases it may not, for all sorts of reasons. So I don't think that, I'd want to say again that there is some magic number beyond which a community economy can't grow, either in an enterprise or in a network of firms or at a regional level. I think it's something that it's an experimental experimental question in a way. Like, how are we going to? What would be the barrier to making things grow larger, and what would be the
I prefer to maintaining a community economy status at a larger scale.
Yeah, and also for the idea of solidarity, that, how far does solidarity go?
Yeah.
If I can't see them and I can't touch them, do I really, how much do I care to put in to their well-being?
But, I think that's the Mondragon Corporation is very clear that the solidarity and the rationale for the whole enterprise was to create employment for Basque people in the Basque region. And that's their primary concern. Now, there's international solidarity is expressed rather more through their educative role and the role that they play in study groups going to Mondragon, like the US steelworkers, and learning about these principles and going back and so on. They feel they can't be doing this kind of core solidarity everywhere. And I think that's a reasonable, decision. It's a sort of a pragmatic and a politically...
I think for me it was just the response they gave when, I think, asked, what are you doing for the workers in Thailand?
Yeah.
It's like, it takes too long. And so for me that was like, okay, there's kind of a gap there of how far.
Well, they're very, that question about overseas workers and cheap labor in some of their factories has been the question. That's the most frequently asked question.
Again, it's such an interesting focus on the limit. But anyway, keep going on that.
I just wanted to say that it's therefore when the educational function is serious. They've got people who go to conferences and people who lead people, tours of Mondragon and there and teach people about it. And I happened to be at one of these conferences where Iñaki was there. And he actually didn't speak English, so he had an interpreter with him. And what was so impressive, and this is just one guy, who's in their education program, but he just wasn't defensive about this. He really could understand why people were so concerned about it. And he recognized that it was a problem, and he said that the cooperators, recognized it as a problem. But they didn't know what they were going to do about it at that point. This was in 2003, I think. So, it's a very interesting question. And when you find big complexes of cooperatives, you find there are a lot of non-cooperators employed. So that all those co-ops are on some level hybrid capitalist cooperative firms. And how they deal with that issue.
But there's also more people who want to be cooperators than they're able to absorb.
And there's also groups that don't want to be cooperators. And that's one way they've gotten non-cooperators is by taking over firms where the workers decided not to be, they didn't want to be cooperators. So anyway, I'm just very impressed with how this is a live question for them. Not a dead issue, even though their principles very clearly put employment for the best at the top. They don't ignore this. Some like Equal Exchange is a fair trade worker co-op, and it's really committed to the people that it's involved with. It's coffee and other things. And they have a community economy. It's sort of spread out around the world, so it's really very large scale, the community economy that they've participated in constructing. The scale of community economy is something sort of up for grabs, really.
But the boundary issues are always going to be an issue, I think. Whatever community is constructed is who's in and who's out, and that's always going to be a live and a question that has to be returned to in order to identify what are the effects of the decisions that are being made.
And like Stephen Goodman's wonderful quote that a community economy makes and shares a commons. Such a beautiful expression of it. And without a commons, there is no community. Without a community, there is no commons. And that's always in there's some boundary because you share it, but not necessarily with everyone, or there's rules. There's rules of sharing. Yeah.
I have a question. Hi, Georgia.
Get in front of that camera then.
I'm also a student. I'm a PhD student here in the program. I realize participatory action research is all about empowerment, but power still, of course, is very much a part of this equation. And so there's power in which communities you go to or don't go to, and there's power as academics going into a place, and there's power. You can talk about it a few times in the book. One point that I really enjoyed was you realized you hadn't explained your definition of economy. Right. This weird, uneven power relationship.
Right.
So how do you negotiate those kinds of issues when you're going into some place? You're an outsider. You're outside of that border, and you're going in and you're trying to change things. And so there's very much a power dynamic wrapped up in that, even when you're doing research that's meant to shift power to the community. So I know it's a really broad question. There's not a real answer, and it's conceptual how you answer it. But I'm kind of curious in the situations that you guys have gotten into and how you dealt with that.
Well, did you say your name was George?
Georgia, yeah.
Hi, George. Just before we answer that question, just something about your question. There just seems to be some presumption that power is a problematic thing to have, or I think that was there, and so not just it's one of the things that needs to be negotiated or dealt with, but that it's not good somehow, or.
I definitely think power can be productive. Absolutely. But as you said in your last question, sometimes there are people that don't want it always. And
they don't want it, yeah. That's part of the resistance, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, if we think practically, we're always going into a community, or just whatever. The approach in terms of any of the research we've done is usually in some collaboration with some organisation or group or whatever that's already involved in the community in some way. And one has a choice. Do you go in with the groups that are already powerful in some senses or not? And in every place there's going to be gatekeepers of what can and can't happen. And so in a way, I suppose we've always had some kind of analysis of who it is we feel we want to work with and can work with, and who has some entree into that community, but they'll always be very situated within a power mesh as well. I'm thinking about the work, both the action research projects in the Latrobe Valley in Australia, where we were partnered with the council, but the council had all sorts of, this is the local municipal council, had all sorts of power dynamics going in with it, and our research definitely got implicated in those in terms of which councillors wanted to see something happening in their ward or not, and that whole power dynamic probably was part of the reasons why it wasn't as successful in some senses as others. But on the other hand, we wanted to work with those people who were seen to be excluded in all sorts of ways from a sense of being enrolled in the economy and being seen as still economic citizens and contributing and so on. So we made an active decision to work with those kinds of constituencies and those kinds of groups. In the Philippines case, we went in a partnership with an NGO that was explicitly enrolled in all sorts of sort of social transformational kind of projects, and were more or less opposed by the municipal government, which had its own power structure and sense of what should happen and way of buying votes and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, in each case, I think it was a very complex negotiation, and I suppose we had to kind of be doing that analysis as we went all the time in terms of trying to prize open possibilities and recognise there were going to be problems with aligning ourselves with this person versus that, or that organisation versus another. So I don't think, and at the same time, the people who are seen as most powerless by academics, the research subjects themselves, have an enormous amount of power over the process and over you as well, in some senses, because of that whole reverse criticism of you're the expert, you're the academic, you don't know anything about this place. And, there's a whole debate that's going on around knowledge and whose knowledge is legitimate and all that kind of stuff. So that's a very interesting kind of thing to work with, and it's an open and fluid process. That if once you have a sort of vision of that, this is an arena of power, but there's no one answer to how to operate, or then I think at every step you're kind of negotiating this and reflecting. Yeah.
I just really, one thing that happens is that in a lot of analysis, people conflate status and power. So there's certain kinds of social status. That's how we call some people the suits. And, and academia is one sort of social status. It's like having a PhD or being a doctor or something like that. But if you conflate that with power, status and power, then you've already done your analysis, There's no point. You're not actually doing an experiment or looking at the flow of power or the shifts, or who has power in that setting. So it's that not knowing, and seeing that if you're really interested in looking at the workings of power in context, you have to be open to, and definitely don't start with those kinds of conflations. And we actually weren't doing action research in our Rethinking Economy project to empower people. We were actually doing it to try to start speaking a different language of economy and see if we could generate it out of people doing interviews and talking to each other. And so it wasn't really about empowerment.
And that whole language of empowerment is problematic in the sense that it is from that framework that sees certain people as powerless and needing to be in a situation
that they need power. Right.
Yeah. But in the development context, it's very hard to get away from that language, and so whatever you do, it gets read as, you're empowering people. So, I think you've written about that kind of thing.
I was wondering how you choose the sites where you come to work with, how you choose the organization. Do you get invited, or do you just go there some specific area? If you do the second one, how do you choose? What criteria do you use? Why do you think some parts are interesting or not? Or if you get invited to these places?
I just to speak for myself, is that the church chose the place closest to buy, so we wouldn't have to pay for travel.
That's right.
Because I think this could be done anywhere. That's kind of the whole point of the project. It's something that any group of people could do.
Yeah, I mean, totally pragmatic in a way, in terms of historical relationships and connections to organisations and
she
places.
She had to do work in Asia because she had a job in the
research school of Pacific and Asian Studies, but I also had a relationship with a particular NGO. Then out of that discussion came the choice. In that sense, I suppose, the choice of the two municipalities that we did the work in the Philippines was through the relationships that NGO had with those places as potentials where something could happen. That the mayors were at least open to something. But I'm about to start a project that's working in 3 Pacific islands, in Fiji, Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. And again, it's in collaboration with an international women's development agency in Australia that already has connections with NGOs in each of those countries, and each of those countries wants to do work on kind of questions around gender and economic development. I don't sit in my ivory tower and decide, Vanuatu, what a lovely place. I think I'll do a project in Vanuatu. it's sort of through. It's sort of by hook or by crook. And then before that, the Latrobe Valley was like Julie's Valley. It was just in my backyard at Monash when I was there. So because I've moved around in universities quite a bit, now I'm living in Western Sydney and I'm thinking about a project in that area because it's where I am.
I'm going to do the same project. We'll talk about it tomorrow. But I'm going to do it in the valley because I haven't moved.
But I mean, the issue of research funds means that if you can do something local, then you're not as constrained. And then if funds do come up, they come up in certain ways, under certain headings, with certain, so Southern Philippines is part of Australia's development interest, so, it made sense to do it in that kind of region. So there's all sorts of other politics around funding that means you get directed in certain directions. So, I don't know that many people these days have the luxury of just sitting down and saying, where in the world would I like to work and what would make it best if I worked here or there. It's not quite like that. So it's very, in a way, quite pragmatic.
My graduate students have specific regional interests, so in the next semester proposal I write, I might, collaborate with one or two of them, and that might take me to certain different regions.
But I mean, what Julie said, I think, is the most important thing, is we feel like we could do this anywhere. And that would mean starting to build some connections with research partners to do it. And most of the work we do these days is in partnership with different kinds of institutions or groups. Partly because you can't do it all yourself anyway. So. And also part of our interest is in building this kind of research collectives or assemblages where we involve more and more people in, not necessarily in our project, but we align our project with what they're already doing and then start that conversation so that the discussion gets broader and we learn a lot that we wouldn't know about too.
I have a question that's kind of a follow-up. My name is Jeff. I'm a master's student in the program, and kind of a follow-up to George's question and some of the themes that you've just been talking about. It seems to me like there's a real challenge that is produced through the labor regime that we have to work under, especially as graduate students, but also junior faculty working toward tenure and things like that, where there's a need to produce there are these questions around authorship when engaged in collaborative research and along the lines of your action research model that I think create all kinds of challenges around the equitable attribution of knowledge and authorship and things like that. And I'm wondering how. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, because the danger is an inherent is like an extractive kind of relationship through this kind of process where you're working with a community, but ultimately you're kind of taking this knowledge for your own career in a way that's removed from maybe the collective objectives that you've articulated together, that you've entered into that work to do. And it seems like a lot of times, we end up having to work on two tracks, one with the community and one kind of pursuing these jumping through these hoops that are part of the institution that we're working in, but don't necessarily correspond to those other objectives.
Well, I'm going to say something that might seem really naive, so I'm probably the oldest person here, but I'm saying about once naive and less worldly wise. I started this after I was tenured, and I actually didn't have any career objectives in doing this kind of work. I really had more life objectives. I was really interested in bridging, I've always been interested in the power of ways of thinking, and I've really been a leftist for a long time, interested in non-campus development. And I just did this because that's what I wanted to do with my life. And that, might seem like, okay, I have a lot of freedom, but it meant there were a lot of pressures to not make decisions that way. I just didn't happen to feel them because I wasn't ambitious in that sense. I think it might be getting harder now for people because there's this new assessment and the bureaucratization of our institutions and disciplines. So when I started doing this kind of stuff, academia was a really great place to do this kind of work. And I think, what you're talking about is less, not as good.
But I think there's
still quite a bit of work to do.
I don't see it as a either or really at all.
Right, exactly.
And if I think about Jenny Cameron, who works with us quite closely, she's someone who has come through at a very different time in the academy, where in Australia we have all these performance criteria and everyone's supposed to be earning points for this, that and the other for articles, so many this per year and all that kind of thing. And yet she has very much worked with community groups. And for instance, a year or so ago she organised a workshop for a whole lot of organisations that are doing work in food area, so organic food, food collectives, buying, community-supported agriculture. And she managed to bring about 12 different activists, people who are enmeshed in these organisations, very much community members activists who didn't have a chance often to sit around and think about what they're doing. And they were absolutely thrilled to be brought into a workshop for the day, to listen to each other's stories, to have it recorded. But they all felt they got so much out of this time of reflection. Now Jenny's established a research relationship with these people and has managed to write up 1 or 2 papers out of that, which they then they love to read, because it's also putting what they're doing in a context that they'd never thought about it. Or they can also get back to her and say, no, I think you got this wrong. We've not got this kind of model. We've got this. So there it was an incredibly productive relationship where all the groups feel like they've got something out of it. They don't at all feel like they've been exploited in this whole thing. And then students are now going and working in each of these organisations, helping them do a social accounting or this kind of thing. She also brought a specialist together in that context. John Pearce has written a lot about community enterprise in the US and UK context. So she was able to use her networks to provide some value in that research relationship for those people, and has also been able to generate the number of the articles and so on that she needed to get to be able to fill in her performance criteria for the year. So I think there's lots of ways that one can do work that answers to multiple sort of agendas.
And I would say, just looking at the Valley and what's going on there and how my work is intermeshed with that of so many activists in the region, I don't see it at all as an extractive relationship. In the sense, sometimes I feel overworked by them, but I'm not resentful. I'm just thinking about the organizations that we've written about, how I'm involved in each of them, and how much use they've made of the work that we've done, and how pleased they are that somebody is, working on their issues. And just recently, Gav and I was at the Rethinking Marxism International Conference, and I organized a track on the community economy with all researchers and activists on all different topics. And so people working in alternative banking or alternative currencies or all different areas, worker co-ops, solidarity economy, all came together for 2.5 days. And it was really useful for people to be together with this academic group that was totally committed to what they were doing and present their stuff to each other and to us. So, that was a pretty good experience.
And when Julie's had the benefit of staying put for 40 years or so that she's got very enmeshed relationships and can keep them going for a long time. A lot of people are more mobile in their careers and have to move around, and the strategy of working in your backyard means that then you might move on. But I guess there's also, there are ways in which you can maintain contact, and say, for instance, in the Latrobe Valley, where a number of community enterprises were started as part of our action research. One of them continues. I mean, a lot of the others fell by the wayside for all sorts of reasons, which I could go into, but they had their 10th anniversary, the Santa's Workshop, one of the enterprises, just this last Christmas. So Jenny and I were able to get back and go to that, and it was just incredible to be able to go back and hear what's been going on since and so on. And I think the same thing with the Philippines groups, even though I'm not actively involved in that project anymore, there's still ways one can keep in touch, and in fact that there's so much value in going back to these things 5 or 10 years later to see what's gone on and to hear about, what some of the impacts were of the research that you never knew at the time. But if you set that as one of your agenda items, then I think you can do it. And then that means that people don't have that sense that it's just sort of a fly-in, fly-out relationship, because it is a relationship, and if you're interested in maintaining them, you can. And I think there's a lot of value in that kind of work where people go back to something many years later. I mean, often people go back to their PhD research site if it's been in another country or something many, many years later. And they do their obligatory book, What Happened Since I Was There Last. But that's not exactly what I was thinking of. But, I think there are ways, especially with the internet and so on these days, to maintain connection with people in a way that perhaps it was much harder to do in the past. And that's a great way of not feeling like it's just been a kind of fly-in, fly-out relationship with people, communities.
Just two more things to say about this, because it's really an important thing. First of all, I have a student right now who was involved in, before he was my student, he was involved in establishing the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, which came out of the U.S. Social Forum in 2007. And one of the big things about establishing that network is writing stuff up about it, kind of bringing it into being that way. And he wants to kind of theorize the solidarity economy, and everybody in the network is kind of wants him to do this. He just doesn't have any time. So he became a master's student with me so he can write a thesis. He got a fellowship at UMass, so he can write a thesis that does that work for his solidarity economy activism. That's just one example of the kind of ways that academia isn't quite what we think it is, it doesn't function quite how we think it does. And another thing is about academic articles. It's not just things that build your career, they're actually things so depressingly few people read them. People do read them. And so they go on and become important in people's teaching. And that teaching, goes on, and those students who get taught from that, they become active in their communities. So it's like, it might seem like the function of an academic article is just to promote your career or further your career. It actually has a much wider function when you think about it. So if you trace some some academic work might be fit in and some isn't. So it's like, where are you going to take your gamble, in academia or somewhere else, in terms of your interventions.
Well, you made this argument throughout the book, or if we're talking about these dynamics between, being limited and focused on kind of restricting ourselves and our world and kind of the openness to possibility. And even right now, I think it's really great that the way some of the discussion has been is you said yourself, like, focus on the limits and how you, like, turn the conversation into the possibilities and, that. I think I really appreciate that and appreciate that throughout the book. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about that process of, being open to possibilities and experiences and all that. And you talked about self-cultivation and becoming new subjects, basically becoming new people, right?
Yeah, it can make you tired.
Exactly. And that was my question. How much effort do you think that requires? Do you think that's an effort? That's a process that requires some conscious effort in order to, for these things to develop, or is it something?
The answer is yes.
Yeah, but when you have the motivation, it doesn't seem like effort.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fun. You know what I mean?
I know, but is it something you do consciously? Is it like something like that?
Until it becomes automatic.
Second
yes.
nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one becomes. Just being conscious of how you think. And reflecting on what it is I'm drawn to think about, or how am I thinking about this issue. That's taking a step back from the thinking in a way, and just doing that analysis will help, I think, you figuring out how much you're dwelling on the limits or the critical positions versus you could be thinking something else. Why is it you're not? So I think we find ourselves, we don't think about it that as much as we did before, but that has been a process of re-examining, what we think about, and then also, I guess, re-examining what we read. We're drawn to reading certain kinds of authors and certain people, and not others. So, it's pretty terrible. But we don't read a huge amount of geography because so much of it is in that critical mode. But when we find someone that isn't, boy, do we go into it. So it's like finding a gem.
Yeah, it's like that question, and it really came up when post-structuralism came along for us, and post-structuralist epistemology. Why do you want to say this about that? Most people can't answer that question.
They feel like they're still revealing the world that's out there. It needs to be revealed by academics, Well, if you give up on that particular view of knowledge or view of the process, then the question becomes,
how do I get to say this about that?
But I was also wondering, because you also mentioned, and you focus a lot of attention on affects and the visceral register, the body, and all that. So a lot of those processes are not something that we can easily point our fingers on and even like consciously control.
But you can feel them. So you can reflect on what you're feeling.
Yeah. So that's kind of like a conscious reflection on what you're feeling.
Well, that's worth asking yourself when you read the next article. How does it make me feel? Not just what is it saying and what kind of thinking strategies have been laid out here, but what was the affect of it?
And you can feel it in any group, like in interactions and academic interactions. I suppose it's what Sarah was talking about when she introduced this discussion. Really? Is that, do I want to be in this room right now? And we really didn't want to be in academia with that feeling that you get at a lot of academic gatherings.
Where it's not an exploratory discussion. It's there's some sort of correct line, or
and you just get to a point where it's just not worth it. It feels too bad. I don't want to be here.
But I guess the old adage is the separation of the mind from the body, and that's happened so much in academia. People don't reflect on their feelings of a situation or take any account of them. So you go to a seminar where certain people are pontificating and everybody else is quiet, and you go away thinking, well, that's the way it's supposed to be somehow. It didn't feel great, but everyone else seems to be putting up with it, so that must be what academia is, So you get to a point where it's just, that you don't trust your feelings. I mean, I think that's what academic education has always put those things as something not to be listened to.
One of the really amazing things is that the study was done that showed that undergraduates felt much more able to talk in class than graduate students. And I can see it, and so when I start my graduate class every year, I'm like, okay, I just want you to know that I know what you're thinking. When that person across the table says something, you're saying to yourself, oh my God, she's a second-year student, and I'm a fifth-year student, and she already can talk like that and knows that. And that thing, and that's just, so much part of academia, is the destruction of the confidence that you had when you came in. And so how to make graduate school a confidence-building experience for people, rather than a confidence-destroying experience. It's just a real question.
How do you do that? Or in a classroom.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right on.
Well, one thing is I bring it out, so that people recognize that that's sort of a hidden agenda in any class. People comparing themselves to each other and feeling nervous, afraid to speak, everything. And then also, I guess in the interactions, there really aren't any wrong points of view or stupid questions or that kind of thing. So that's just kind of like trying to interact with people really at that level where you're not going to treat them with scorn. Because, scorn and shame are such potent things in these kinds of contexts. And the tone of voice. I still remember being in an AAG session once, and a young woman was talking to me so scornfully, like I was really morally degraded, maybe more even than I am. So, for thinking certain things and saying them. She was very hostile. So afterwards, I said, why do you speak to me in that tone of voice, And she just had this look on her face. She just realized, she just heard herself for the first time. And she just realized she did because it's academia and that's how you talk to people who you don't agree with and who are saying stupid things. Yeah. And I didn't call her on it in front of everybody. Maybe I should have. But I didn't talk to her afterwards. And, that's really... and I've done that in my classes to my students. Talk to them in that critical tone of voice. And I hear myself later, and I have to go and apologize. I haven't done it for many years, but I definitely started out occasionally doing that. Really giving it to them.
Of course, if they haven't done their reading, you should do that anyway.
Right. Everybody at UMass does their reading. They're all working 20 hours a week and taking 5 classes.
We should, I don't want to end the discussion because I think there's a lot to talk about, but we should maybe
about
This
the
course
formal
is
part of the discussion. And since we said we were going to kind of go with that until 5:30, so we've gone a little bit over that. So we're going to end that part there. There are some light snacks, I guess, outside. I hear them out there, so I'm assuming.
Snacks are talking.
So yeah, the pot,
You've got
we have
noisy
special
snacks.
things in Arizona. So please help yourselves and come back and Julie and Catherine are still going to be around for a while. So everybody please feel free to introduce yourselves. And thank you.
Okay, we can end this part.